minutes, and I'll get right back to you.
Sue, everything's fine. I had to reset it.
Yeah, I think we're good to go now. Mr.
right.
Berman, go right ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see and hear me because I seem to have lost my interface to the Zoom. But hopefully, if I'm transmitting okay, then I'm going to carry on and I can troubleshoot later. So
yes, we can hear and see.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So as you said, Dr. Chu, there was 2 parts to the charge question. We had 3 panel members who were assigned to the charge question, and we had 2 additional commenters. All 5 essentially responded to the second part of the second question, which is whether or not they believe that the 20% or 0.2 RSC is adequately supported and clearly described. So the summary was that all 5 of the board members who responded did agree that the 20% or 0.2 RSC is the appropriate one. However, there was questions on whether EPA had clearly demonstrated how they got to the 20% determination, and also some additional questions that were raised. So I'll of course let all the other panelists speak to their responses too, but my kind of summary is that these qualifiers and questions really kind of fell into two broad categories, and I will try and summarize that. So the first issue really here has to do with how closely the RSC section in the PFAS and PFOA MCLG draft document conforms to the 2000 EPA guidance for deriving ambient water quality criteria for protection of human health, which is cited as the reference document that EPA has relied on to come up with the 20% related resource contribution. So the important concept to mention here in terms of that 2000 guidance is that the guidance really provides for a range of 20% to 80% for the relative source contribution. So it's the floor value, as it is referred to, the minimum default value is 20%, which is also the most stringent or most protective public health criteria. And the most that the 2000 guidance allows to be used for the RSC is the 80%. So the most important concept that certainly the 3 panelists who were assigned to this charge question would like to reiterate and recap, really referring back to that 2000 guidance, is that the RSC is the portion of the RFD that is allocated to drinking water. So this is dependent on the portion of the RFD that is known or assumed to come from non-drinking water sources. So therefore, the most relevant parameter for the selection or determination of the RSC is the percentage of the RFD that comes from the non-drinking water sources. So what that then, as per the 2000 guidance, what that leads to is the concept that the actual PFOA, PFAS exposure from drinking water are not directly factored into the RSC determination. Specifically, the percentage of total PFOA, PFAS that comes from drinking water is expressed as a fraction of the reference dose, not as a fraction of the total intake. And this is a very important concept that's really laid out in the 2000 guidance, which is referenced by EPA as being the basis for the determination. So what happens here is that really the RSC, it represents the exposure from drinking water as a fraction of the RFD, and that fraction is the MCLG. So that's how it's simple math, how that works. So it's a little deceptively simple because at least in the experience of a couple of the panel members, including myself, this seems to be a somewhat pervasive issue that shows up frequently where there is maybe confusion's too strong a word, but definitely variable interpretations of what is the denominator when you determine the fraction of the percentage. The denominator really is the RFD, not total exposure from the contaminant in question. So really, it's the relationship of PFOA, PFAS intake from water relative to total intake is not the fraction. The fraction is that intake of PFOA, PFAS from water as a fraction of the RFD that's being proposed here. So this is where perhaps there is some fundamental clarity that's needed in the PFOA, PFAS, MCLG draft documents. Is the RSC sections in both documents seem to present the RSC as both a fraction of the RFD, but also as a fraction of the total intake of PFOA, PFAS. So the relationship is total intake of the PFOA, PFAS exposure over the RFD, or the PFOA, PFAS exposure over from water over the total intake of PFOA and PFAS. So the sections in both the documents seem to alternate between these two, which then causes some fundamental questions about which one is EPA really using, and is the other more of an illustrative purpose only, but not the true basis. But conformity with the 2000 guidance, and that's how MCLGs are calculated, really requires that you're looking at the exposure from PFOA and PFAS from drinking water as a fraction of the RFD. And then again, that equates the MCLG. So that's a very fundamental concept that is not clear in the document, if that's how EPA got to the 20% of the 0.2. So the members that were assigned to this agree with the 20% 0.2 as being the appropriate value, but have questions about the EPA, how did EPA get there? Did they really use the 2000 guidance, which they say they did, or was there some alternative approach used? The other theme that emerged from the commenters from the panel was some other important considerations having to do with the protection to more vulnerable populations, such as infants and children. Is there adequate protection being afforded to communities that have higher exposure, either from non-drinking water sources of PFOA and PFAS, or because they have drinking water contamination? And then other data sources that are available, such as the National Blood Serum Database on not PFOA, PFAS exposure. So those are very important questions that are integral to development of the RFDs and the MCLGs, and they're being accounted for in the process. But as per the EPA 2000 guidance, the RSC determination is not the right vehicle for accommodating those concepts in the MCLG calculation. It's sort of these aspects are really independent of how the 2000 guidance says that the RSC should be developed. Again, the RSC sections in both these documents for PFOA, PFAS involve and refer to these other concepts, also cite many references. And again, it's not clear if that's just being used in terms of evidentiary purposes, sort of using a multiple lines of evidence approach as supportive information, but really the actual RSC determination was in conformity with the 2000 guidance, and therefore really is a fraction of the RFD that comes from drinking water, and it's independent of these other factors. So that is sort of the two broad themes that emerged, not just from the SAB panel members, but also in more than one of the public comments. We're kind of seeing these same two themes. Was there real conformity with the EPA 2000 guidance, particularly in terms of that fundamental definition and process of what the right of source contribution really is? And then again, how are these other factors being accommodated for? So again, I think we saw very extensive discussion yesterday on the remaining areas of this document, which are very scientifically, technically rigorous, and there are some profound issues. And at the end of all that comes what seems to be this almost this mechanical process of applying the RSC to the RFD and gives you the MCLG. But again, I think it's a little deceptive perhaps in its simplicity, because we're seeing a couple different areas of variable interpretation. So I think that's where the certainly the three members charged with this question we are of the opinion that this is it's necessary for EPA to provide these clarifications as to whether or not the 2000 guidance was really complied with, and also how are these other issues being addressed. And these other issues are important; they can't be dismissed, but perhaps they are being picked up elsewhere in the RFD determination process and the MCLG process, and they don't really belong in that final stage of just determining what the RSC fraction should be. So because the documents from EPA refer to all these factors, it's not clear whether they are directly being used to determine the RSC or not. And if not, then perhaps how else are they being accommodated? So again, we see these teams keep popping up. And in the interest of just the overall discourse, not just on the RSC, but MCLGs overall, I think these are important considerations to address. It would definitely help get us to a robust, common understanding of how the RSC was determined, and also just assuring various parties that these other factors are not being disregarded. They're just not directly being addressed by the RSC determination, perhaps, but they're certainly built into the overall process in other places. So that's sort of my summary, and we'll see if I hit the mark on this. And I'll start with asking the two panel members specifically assigned to this question, Dr. Post and Dr. Chen, and then moving on to Dr. Plunfedenik and Dr. DeWitt, who also commented. So perhaps Dr. Chen, we can start with you for your comments and go from there.
Yes, Andy, this is a very good summary. I actually do not have anything to add. It's well said. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. Dr. Post?
Thank you, Sandy, for the summary. It was really on the mark and well put. So I just have a few additional comments. To make it a little bit more like explicit what Mr. Berman was talking about as far as the confusion or the way it's explained in the draft document, as he said and explained very clearly, that relative source contribution is based on the portion of the reference dose that comes from non-drinking water sources, and it has nothing to do with, it's the drinking water concentration at the guideline level, in this case, the MCLG, that you can have so you won't exceed the reference dose. So the total of non-drinking water and drinking water sources will not exceed the reference dose. So after you account for how much is from other sources like food, consumer products, whatever, that the rest of the reference dose can be from water, and that is how we set the MCLG. So statements from the draft documents that suggest that in communities where there's higher drinking water contamination, higher levels of drinking water contamination, that a higher relative source contribution is supported there or might be appropriate there. That is not relevant to setting the RSC. Also, some of the references that were cited from the scientific literature also had this same misunderstanding, which is pervasive, and as many people have this misunderstanding in my experience. So those papers talked about, they did studies of the percent of total exposure that comes from water in the US or in other countries, and showed that it was in the range of 20%. Those types of studies are not relevant to this because it has to do with the reference dose. And in this case, the reference dose is very low compared to older reference doses. So assuming that the non-drinking water exposure stays the same, obviously a higher percent is going to come from non-drinking water sources when the number you're comparing to is very low. As far as some data that backs this up, the New Jersey Drinking Water Quality Institute and also the European Food Safety Authority reviewed information on PFOA and PFAS in food it was the data indicated that PFOA and PFAS in the diet are almost 2 orders of magnitude higher than the proposed reference doses, EPA's draft reference doses. And on top of that, we have other sources of exposure, obviously. So it's clearly evident that we get much more exposure than the reference dose from the diet and other sources. And the floor value, the lowest value, is 20%. So that supports that clearly. Another source of information is biomonitoring data, serum levels of PFOA and PFAS. The serum PFOA levels associated with the reference dose can be determined by multiplying the reference doses by the uncertainty factor of 10. And that would give that would give this, let me say it the other way. The document presents points of departure based on serum levels, and then they're later converted to the administered dose. But if you divide those serum levels by 10, the total, which is the uncertainty factor, then you would get the serum level at the reference dose. And those serum levels associated with the reference dose are about 20 to 30-fold below the lower percentile, which is I'm using the 5th percentile. From the latest NHANES data, which represents the US general population, the latest data from 2017 and 2018, the serum levels associated with the RFD are about 20 to 30-fold lower than the 5th percentile in that data set. So presumably the 5th percentile from the general population wouldn't be exposed to contaminated drinking water, or at least that's my assumption. So that demonstrates also that the serum PFOA and PFAS levels, even in the lowest percentiles of the general population, far exceed 100% of the reference dose, supporting the default or the floor value of 20%. Mr. Berman mentioned about some of the public comments and some of the other panel members. Well, maybe I'll continue this after the other panel members present their comments, because it has to do with their comments. I won't continue now. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Post. Dr. Plinfetnik, would you like to go next?
I have nothing to add at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. DeWitt?
I also don't really have anything else to add. I think that you addressed my concern about additional protections in your excellent summary. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So maybe we'll go back to Dr. Post and let her finish up.
So I think some of the public comments Sandeep, can you refresh my memory? Did any of the public comments say that sensitive subpopulations should be considered, or was that not in the public comments?
There was at least one public comment that sort of raised the issue.
Okay, well, I'll just
in a sense that just clarity is needed as to how EPA would address that or not address it if it's not relevant to the RSC. But yeah. Okay,
and I'll just, in any case, if anybody on the panel or anyone has questions about whether the RSC is protective of specifically infants and children, basically the reference dose is based on exposure to children, and that was the most sensitive endpoint. It was determined to be the most, so that would be protective, but also in states where when drinking water guidelines were developed for PFOA and PFAS that considered infant exposure using the model that was the GAIN model that Minnesota Department of Health developed, and it's actually been used by other states as well as Minnesota. They determined that young infants they get less of a % of exposure from other sources than older people. So at least with the reference doses they were using, and it could be different, of course, for these lower reference doses. In those cases, it was determined that a higher relative source contribution was appropriate for infants, whereas the 20% was appropriate for older individuals with those reference doses. So what I'm trying to say is that in the way this was done does protect sensitive subpopulations, specifically infants and children. That was a long way around of saying that. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Post. So, Dr. Chu, again, before I hand back to you, so just to summarize, really two main themes here. One is just a better and more clear and more transparent way to really tie in the draft documents to that 2000 guidance in terms of the fact that the 20% is the most protective RSC that is provided for in the guidance, and just clarifying how the process of looking at all the other evidence gets you to that conclusion could perhaps be better described. And then also there are references in the in both the PFOA, PFAS documents to other exposures, sensitive populations, blood serum databases. So all those are reference citations provided, but then as we just heard from Dr. Post, that those are not directly relevant to the RSC determination. However, they're important aspects in their own right. So, and they are picked up elsewhere in the process. So perhaps just decoupling those from the RSC process, but giving them due consideration or showing that they're still receiving due consideration. Those are some areas that would just perhaps move this RSC discussion, allow EPA to move this RSC discussion forward in a more constructive and streamlined way. So that's it. And I guess Dr. Chu, back to you. And I'm not sure if you would, if I am the one that asks for anyone else to comment or.
Sure. Does anyone else have any comments?
Yeah, this is Jeff Fisher. So what you're saying is that exposure to these substances, only 20% probably comes from water, and then 80% comes from somewhere else. And so are other agencies working on the other 80%, or what happens with that exposure pathway? Is that outside the purview of this committee?
Can I explain it a little bit?
Go ahead.
I'd like the EPA to explain it.
No, I just wanted to explain about what you're not what other agencies are doing, but how you started off your question. Basically, like the information I presented shows that we're getting not 80% from other sources, but multiples of the reference, much more than 100% of the reference dose from other sources. And the way it's explained in the EPA guidance, why the lowest value that's recommended in the guidance is 20%, you shouldn't go lower than that. It just say you're getting the way it's explained by EPA in their guidance is that if more than that, like 99% or 99.9% is coming from other sources, it's not worthwhile to just keep making the drinking water standard lower and lower, because that doesn't address the problem. The other sources of exposure should be addressed. So that's why the floor of 20%, that's what I wanted to clarify. But basically what it's saying is in the diet and other sources, we're getting more than the proposed reference doses, which are much lower, obviously, than the older reference doses. And other chemicals that EPA has developed reference doses in the past, like dioxin at the time when where they were drafted, had the same issue, that it was concluded that general population exposure was above the reference dose.
So all this work might not reduce population exposure much, I guess. That's what I'm
No,
thinking.
that's not, no, because when drinking water is contaminated, it very low levels like will overwhelm the general population exposures. And that's been one of the big points in the information that my colleagues and I have been putting out in our publications and our government reports for quite a few years. When it's in drinking water, even low levels overwhelm the other exposures. So it is important to address it in drinking water. Like for PFOA, with our estimation, maybe there's fancier models now, but if you add less than 20 nanograms per liter of PFOA in water, that will exceed the general population exposure. So when water is contaminated, it can overwhelm the other exposures easily.
Okay, so there are situations that's helpful. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, I'm not going to re-summarize what Zandeep just summarized very succinctly. Now we've finished all the official charge questions, but I did want to, given how late it got yesterday, open the floor to additional comments or revisiting some issues that may not have been fully discussed. I believe Dr. Slitt, did you have a specific topic you wanted to raise or to reopen?
I would say not entirely. I just want to make sure that, or I guess reiterate that the document really should even-handedly and systematically and transparently discuss the different critical effects. And as we've debated as a committee, it's certainly not with these charge questions that I don't think that immune effects and antibody titers are not important. They're definitely important, especially in the context of what we're living through right now. But I think for the sake of the document and transparency, they will have to justify this. And again, because I think this is a concern from the public comments, that there has to be a strong justification for why a decrease in antibody titer to toxoids in particular could have a meaningful health outcome. I think Dr. DeWitt did a really compelling job of explaining that to us, but now the document has to be able to have that type of more thorough justification. And then even after that justification, perhaps going back and weighing other critical health effects that we discussed in light of the discussion of the committee, and maybe coming up with some sort of strategy to weight those different critical effects, and so to systematically have a justification. And I guess one thing that I think about is also just the weight of the evidence. And in particular, what I mean by that is this an effect that is seen by, can this effect be reproduced? Is it reproducible by numerous investigators? Is there concordance between rodent and human studies? And I don't really have a particular, Jamie had mentioned that we kind of all have our own kind of pet, outcomes, if you will. But I don't really think about it that way. I just really think about it more for there to be an agnostic process up front to kind of get to that question. So that's really just my comment. It's more kind of a bigger comment as we reflect upon the discussions from yesterday.
Great. Dr. Olmsted?
Yeah, thanks so much. I think this is related to Dr. Slitt's comment just now. And it's been so interesting to listen to this very robust discussion of all these different potential health effects, over the discussion yesterday and starting today. And this is related to a comment that I'll make as we get into the discussion of the CBD impacts in just a little while. But I think it would be really helpful to hear a little bit, backing up even further, kind of big picture from the agency about which of these health effects, that were discussed yesterday, they're thinking might be incorporated into the benefit side of the benefit cost analysis that eventually would be done for the MCLG. And I say that because as we get into the discussion of the CBD impacts, that piece is further along, right? We're sort of already at the point where they've, started to get to the point to estimate some benefits, or, at least in terms of health, but not yet monetized. And I don't know whether that's because that work is just further along, or that the benefit estimates ultimately will hinge on just those total cholesterol estimates, right? Where these others may be quantified to the extent possible, but not monetized. And that would be really helpful because it sounds like from the discussion yesterday, some of those endpoints, there's actually maybe even more robust, kind of epidemiological evidence than what we have in the TC context. And so I'm just trying to, like my economist brain, right, is trying to understand, right, how all this is going to come together and what the agency's plan is for the benefit side, of that regulatory impact analysis.
No, that's a great point. And I think that gets at, some of the discussion yesterday that many of these, the main four outcomes that we discussed, the non-cancer outcomes, they're biomarkers, and they're not, overt disease. And for CVD, they have developed this, approach to relate the biomarker to a monetizable risk, but it's not clear that to the extent to which the other endpoints, whether it's antibody response, birth weight, liver enzymes, to whether those, whether there has been work or is there a plan to again use those biomarkers to relate to a monetizable endpoint.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I know that in the birth weight side, there are estimates in the economics literature, right, that could be used to do that. The others, I have no idea, but it would be worth looking into. And the agency may already have thought this whole chain through. It's just as we get into the discussion of the CBD piece, right, critiques of that are relatively more important if the whole kind of benefits, kind of monetized benefit story is going to hinge on that. Versus if we're going to reach into these other areas as well, where maybe that's right, where we could sort of take things a little bit more with a grain of salt. So it would just be really helpful, I think, to get a little bit of a bigger picture view.
Right. And then going back to cancer, certainly for cancer, it is for renal cell carcinoma, that would be a monetizable. And if the testicular cancer were also included, as there was some discussion of also looking at that potentially for maybe the C8 studies, that would also be another monetizable endpoint, it seems.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Well, I guess, is there any, in terms of liver enzymes and antibody titers, I guess, does anyone on the committee have any thoughts as to, how those could be quantitatively related to a monetizable endpoint, or at least an outcome that's more of a discrete outcome rather than just a biomarker? Dr. SAB?
Yeah, no, I think, again, it is probably best developed for cholesterol and heart disease because that's a more prominent topic, probably. But I would have optimism, Jamie or others may want to comment, for example, that if that there would be estimates to translate a given percentage decrement in antibody response to vaccines to the magnitude of increased risk. It would be a speculative, I'm sure. I know with birth weight, it's complicated because it's kind of an indirect marker, but again, with some imagination, it's back to that issue that all of them have flaws. None of them provide a clean, easy, unarguable path from the observed changes related to PFAS to the clinical health consequences. But again, I think that with the right expertise, it may be a level of effort that really goes beyond what's realistic. But these are all pretty well developed research areas. We're not the first ones to ask a question: do antibody changes affect disease risk? Do liver enzymes reflect a certain risk of chronic liver disease, et cetera? They're reasonably well explored topics. Now, whether there's an off-the-shelf model like there is for cholesterol, I doubt it. That would be, I think, the big difference.
Dr. DeWitt?
So I've been going through some of the previous studies where antibody responses are used as predictors for changes in host resistance. And one of the challenges is that quantitative value associated with a reduction in the antibody response. So what reduction is associated with a numerical risk? And I'm having a hard time finding some actual values. You know, there are some earlier studies that talk about shifts in host resistance, which is in an animal model, an animal's overall response to some sort of a pathogen. Some people use influenza, some people use nematodes, and the antibody response and how they're analogous. And it looks like shifts in host resistance and shifts in the antibody response follow the same magnitude of response. So if host resistance is decreased by 5%, then the antibody response is also decreased by about 5%, but that doesn't really answer our question. So if everybody is okay, I can do some additional digging, and in my revised responses to charge questions can include that information if I can find it. If not, I can enhance my responses to at least explain the potential risks and clinical relevancy of the suppressed antibody responses that are right now driving the reference dose.
Yeah, no, I think that would be useful if there are references that and summary of some of the literature could be useful. I mean, both for, as we talked yesterday, for substantiating the hazard, but also in terms of taking that next step and potentially looking at the benefits. Dr. Slade?
Yeah, so I just wanted to follow up on that. Jamie, first of all, I do think you are the expert who could find those articles. And that was where I got caught up when I was trying to answer this question. I tried for about an hour of just throwing in different search terms to see what studies existed for if there was a decreased response to vaccination, what were the outcome, what were the changes in outcomes, risks, et cetera. And I just could not find that literature. And I kind of concluded that I just didn't have the expertise maybe to look for those papers in the right way, because it's much easier for me being a liver person to look at ALT. So I definitely would say to the EPA, reach, in addition to Dr. DeWitt, to kind of find immunologists who really can dig into that question in a really meaningful way. And it's obviously important. This is honestly a conversation that we're having all the time about antibody levels to COVID vaccinations, right? So I don't really know what literature is out there, but this is clearly on everyone's mind. And I think that it just requires some expertise to get to those clinical kind of epidemiology studies that might point to that. Because I think that's kind of a very relevant question. And again, it was really voiced in the public comments. And so I think we do have a duty to try to have the document have more transparency with that endpoint.
Right. Dr. Kaiser?
Thanks. And I would want to say thanks to Dr. Olmsted for raising those issues earlier. It's something that has been on my mind a little bit as well as we've discussed these documents. And so one of the things that I was looking at yesterday as well was just to see if there was some economics related to monetizing elevated, say, ALT levels or liver enzyme levels. And it seems like there are some studies that look at, I don't know that research that well, but there are some studies that look at, say, cost of fatty, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or other liver diseases, but I don't know to the extent we feel comfortable suggesting those studies to the EPA if there isn't necessarily a tie between the elevated liver enzymes due to PFAS and these other diseases. So that might be something just to throw out to the group if there are others that know that literature better. But if we think about making a recommendation to EPA to look at some of these costs of disease burden, we might just want to think about how comfortable we feel between making the connection, say, between, say, elevated liver enzymes and some other outcome that then is what's monetized in these other studies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think we should feel free to point out the potentially relevant literature. I mean, it'll be up to them to actually justify connecting the dots. And, you know, if there are, for instance, there was discussion yesterday of ALT being associated with increased morbidity and mortality. I mean, you know, that would be, sure, even if it's non-specific, that would be something that would be monetizable. The question is whether that that linkage would be viewed, you know, as robust enough to as, you know, from a counterfactual kind of intervention point of view, that it would actually, you know, be something that would occur rather than just a you know, some confounding association.
That's a great point. Thanks.
All right, any other comments and questions on the MCLG document? We're already starting to bleed into the CVD. So if not, I'm going to propose that we close the discussion on the PFOA and PFAS MCLG discussions, and then move on to our next agenda item, which is highlights from the CVD risk reduction analysis by Ms. Morgan McCabe at the Office of Water.
Thank you, Dr. Chu. So thank you again to the panel. I'd first like to thank the panel for their thoughtful questions and input provided during the overview meeting on December 16th, as well as the preliminary written comments and feedback that the panel has provided. The previous meeting, we presented on EPA's CVD risk reduction analysis, and our charge questions asked the panel to weigh in on the extent to which the CVD risk reduction analysis is scientifically supported and clearly described. As we mentioned, we intend to apply this methodology in the health risk reduction and cost analysis for the proposed PFAS drinking water regulations. I'd like to take this opportunity to follow up on some of the points made in the discussion we just heard, and address some of those questions. So first, I'll say that we are currently working to evaluate all of the adverse health effects that were identified in the MCLG documents, both the cancer and the non-cancer health endpoints for quantification in the HRCA. So it's not just the CVD work. In a way, yes, the CVD work is the furthest along, and it's also complex in the way that we link total cholesterol to the CVD outcome, and therefore we're asking the panel to review it. But I will note that we expect and are currently evaluating whether we can quantify additional benefits using the best available science. I'll note that, you know, as the economists and others on the panel well know, in addition to strong health risk data, we also need other information, other data, other models to link that in many cases to the health outcome and the adverse health effects. So I hear Dr. Savitz pointing out off-the-shelf models. Yes, those are in some cases might be needed, especially given our really tight regulatory timeframe in order to quantify the benefits of those health effects. But I would certainly say, to Dr. Kaiser's point, if there are studies that the panel has identified that may help make those linkages, pointing us in that direction and would be really helpful feedback that EPA would consider. Finally, I just want to note that we also consider non-quantified benefits in our rulemaking process. So that's if we aren't able to quantify benefits, we still consider the non-quantified benefits of the rule. And the last point I'll make is that we are closely looking at the panel's feedback on the adverse health effects and the findings from the MCLG white papers. And so to some extent, that input will factor in and determine what we can quantify as well. So hopefully that helps address some of those questions. If there are clarifying questions, I'd be happy to address them. I also just quickly wanted to, again, reiterate that as the panel deliberates, EPA has committed to proposing the drinking water rule by the fall of 2022. Of course, the economic analysis will be an integral part of that proposal and important for the agency in meeting this commitment to the public. Your input is critical to the agency's efforts to develop regulations that address PFAS in drinking water. And we'll be here for the duration of today's meeting and able to answer clarifying questions as needed. And again, I would just really like to sincerely thank the panel for providing your time and expertise on these important matters. And I really look forward to hearing the deliberations this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. McCabe. So our first charge question is, let me see, where is it? Aha, here it is. Providing feedback on the extent to which study selection criteria, identified studies, and methodological approach of the meta-analysis are complete and capture up-to-date scientific literature. And then the part B is providing feedback on the extent to which this approach is reasonable or whether a single dose response study, such as the Dong et al. 2019 study, would be the most appropriate to be selected for cholesterol impacts. So Dr. Savitz is the lead discussant on this question.
Okay, thank you. As you'll recall, Weishe, we also had, you and I were the ones who actually took the time and offered some comments on what they call the overall charge question about addressing the way that, addressing this particular topic in sort of an overview role. And Sue asked that I go ahead and try to summarize that as well. So let me start with the overall charge question. Let me see if I have it in front of me. The phrasing of it was, EPA is seeking SAB evaluation on the extent to which the approach in estimating reductions in CBD risk associated with reductions in exposure to PFOA and PFAS in drinking water is scientifically supported and clearly described. And so in our two comments, there were several that we both made, and this has been made by a number of the outsiders as well. The discrepancy between the lack of clear empirical support for an impact of these chemicals on clinical cardiovascular disease. They describe it in the report as mixed. I personally think it's actually somewhat negative and not, dismissing the possibility, but it's clearly not supportive. And yet CVD is focused on as the primary outcome. And I think to an extent, if the question then that both of us raised was, well, what about these other outcomes? And I think what would be my anticipations, what would be found in each case, as we've talked about, is fairly clear support for the biomarker, or I consider birth weight a biomarker, just not a chemical, but the biomarkers of effect, yet in the absence of anything very persuasive about the clinical consequence that biomarker should be predictive of. So it's not to say it shouldn't be done, but again, this issue we were just talking about of whether I don't think a good case can be made that CVD is the one where everything fits together and it's the compelling one relative to these others. It may be perfectly fine to say the others just are not as developed in terms of the modeling of the cost impacts And this is the one we're going to use in cardiovascular disease, is the one where there is this pathway defined. But again, as we talked about, and as Dr. McCabe just said, it is well worth exploring the feasibility of doing one or two, if not all three of the other ones, if there's anything and if there's time to apply or develop new models. So again, back to the old, really addressing the same issue. The other issues that I had raised was, again, just a clear sort of overview of the assumptions. It's a very complicated story they're telling of the, the regulation, the change in the chemical, the change in the cholesterol, the change in the heart disease risk. And just kind of I think it's all in there, but a sort of a clear synopsis of the timing events and the presumed causal sequence, and really some explicit statement. These are the assumptions that are made in order to get from the beginning to the end. That again, it's all in there, but it gets kind of bogged down in the great level of detail. And then again, also my suggestion of a sensitivity analysis to consider where there are key assumptions made that were at least in the discretionary range. We could look at it this way or that way. It would be really helpful to have some sense of how impactful those kinds of reasonable alternatives would be. Again, not carrying through the full analysis in 20 different ways, but at least exploring some key decision points. So I'll continue with charge question 1, and then if there's discussion that others want to raise, we can talk about it all at that point. The others who reviewed it were Drs. Chen and Lipworth. And so, but we also had some comments from Dr. Kaiser, Ma, Hammett, Chu. There were isolated comments from all of them. One of the consistent themes in discussing the study selection criteria and the work that was done, there were several areas that had some pretty consistent input and suggestions. And one of those is one we talked about a little bit yesterday, but it's the issue of which studies were excluded and why, and having a clear and consistent rationale for exclusion. We talked about some of the ambiguities in what is a special population, or where's the line drawn between a population that's considered too special to include. Is that even justified? Is there reason to think they react differently just because they're in a higher exposure range? But that exclusion was one of the key issues. Again, several people, the quality assessment of the studies, confidence levels, risk of bias assessment, again, topics we touched on yesterday, but using the example of in the case of confounding, does sort of a insufficient adjustment for socioeconomic status warrant dismissal of the study's evidence? Sort of how the quality assessment was done and the conclusions that were made and the consequences on the ultimate outcomes. Something that Dr. Lipworth raised is the decision not to include HDLC, the so-called good cholesterol, based solely on the failure to attain statistical significance. That, and again, it's on the fence as to whether it warrants inclusion as a part of the impact assessment on heart disease. And then finally, something that a number of us came back to this issue of the impact of alternative options that could have been selected. There were a number of different sort of suggestions for what might have been done differently. One suggestion about raising the perhaps reliance on NHANES as the most nationally representative source, or looking at the studies that use different methods of confounder adjustment. I raised the issue about cholesterol lowering medications. So there were a number of sort of decisions made where at least I put it all under the rubric of, and what if it had been done differently? What if would it have had material impact on the overall results? Sort of a little bit of a discussion of the decisions and the impact of those decisions, even in a very rough sort of sensitivity analysis. So, excuse me, let me stop there and invite comments from any of those who commented either on the overall charge or maybe I should start with the assigned reviewers. Dr. Lipworth, if you want to speak to any of the issues that I touched on or add.
Yeah, thanks. That was really an excellent summary, I think, of my points and others. I didn't actually submit written comments on the overall charge question, but some of my comments later on, I am in agreement with the idea that even if EPA concludes that there is evidence, strong evidence, convincing evidence of an association between PFOA and cholesterol, which is a clinical biomarker of cardiovascular risk, I think it's important for us to consider that there's really no compelling evidence of an increased risk of heart disease. And so, EPA made that decision not to calculate a reference dose for cardiovascular disease, and the epidemiologic evidence does not support that association. So it is a leap to go from the biomarker to the disease in whatever model we choose to use, ASCVD or something else. The point you raised about HDL, I think, is an important one because it is, it's a decision made based on lack of statistical significance, I would say. There's a lot of heterogeneity in the studies, and sometimes that would lead one to conclude that you would rather use a single well-done study to calculate, as opposed to a meta-analysis where you're throwing in some lower quality studies. But I think generally you covered that discussion perfectly. So thanks.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Chen, I don't know if you, I don't know if you had written comments. I hope I captured them, but if you had any points you wanted to raise or add at this on either the overarching topic or the specific issue of the meta-analysis.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. David. I actually, I have some comments about the meta-analysis. Especially, so EPA, I think the overall methodology is reasonable to get 14 studies to be involved in the meta-analysis. But, in the meta, it seems like multiple enhanced studies were involved. I was wondering, because there's some overlap, some, studies looking at like 2013 and 2014, and the other one looked at 2003 to 2014. So in that kind of overlap, I just don't understand quite well whether those studies are considered like different studies putting the meta-analysis, or it just only involve one of them, which is inclusive of all the study populations over years. So that is one area I feel like that can be more clear to helping us to understand that. And there's one study particularly I was reading the Fifth Simon study in 2013 published in Epidemiology, which was on the C8 panel. They actually followed up people from Ohio River area, and then certainly in this longitudinal study can show the change in PFAS levels over time, over actually 4 years. And then they actually observed the lipid level changes over that time period. And actually it's a prospective study, even though it's not considered the general population, but I think it's really, lend us some support looking at how changes in PFAS level is related to change in lipid levels. I really wanted that study to be at least considered, and not necessarily in the meta, but actually you can, in a way, synthesize that evidence to looking at how this really change in levels in PFAS is related to the outcomes like lipid levels. So those are my main my main comments. I think overall in the strategy probably won't change the results, whatever you do different sensitivity on that, but it seems like a little more addition is added to the discussion of how these data is synthesized. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Good. Thank you. I mean, again, I think both points are very important, and I think Dr. Chu may have also raised the issue of maybe it's the only study, the longitudinal change, which again, when we talk about the impact of regulation, it's a longitudinal change that we're talking about. Obviously, at some point, it's a steady state, but at least, worth mentioning that it is supportive of there being a consequence to reductions in blood PFAS levels. And secondly, in terms of the sensitivity analysis, this is what I think, at least the way I've sort of frame it, I honestly do not think that a whole range of decisions that we've talked about will make much difference at the end. Interestingly, the literature is pretty consistent there. I think Dr. Hammett had some calculations where if you take extreme outliers, but whether it's from a meta-analysis or there's restrictions put on it and so on, I think that the important thing is to take an empirical look at what would be the consequences on the key parameters that come out of this under at least some alternative decision-making algorithms. I think that would be beneficial. Others who wish to comment who did or didn't do so before? Sheila.
Thanks for that. It's so helpful. I guess I was surprised a little to see that all but one of those 11 studies in the meta-analysis were cross-sectional. And then and I agree that the cross-sectional one, the longitudinal one is nice, it's a high-risk population, but the lifestyle modification in the randomized control trial, which is a really good study, ameliorates the effect. And so again, that's the one that stands out to me as is a really, kind of useful marker. And if that is what the TC, kind of effects in the benefits analysis hinge on, I feel it's going to leave, EPA open to some criticism, and I would tend to be on board with that criticism. So that I just wanted to flag again my agreement with that. It's heartening that their estimates in that one study are similar to the cross-sectional estimates in literature, right? So that's nice. But again, to the degree that the benefits analysis is going to rely on this, I think that's going to be a real challenge for the agency.
Thank you. I mean, again, maybe if we have just a minute, in terms of the issue of the cross-sectional analysis, I wasn't sure if there's a concern with reverse causality, or in other words, when let's say that we observe at a point in time, which is what almost all the studies did, a correlation of the PFAS levels and the cholesterol levels. I don't know if you have some specific sort of biases that might intrude on that kind of study.
It's more that I wondered, and again, this is the risk of stepping way outside of my lane, right? So many more people here are much more qualified than I. But my general concern would be something like, folks who are predisposed to, high total cholesterol would be for the same reason predisposed to, or similar reasons predisposed to sensitivity.
I mean, that's what I raised under this sort of challenging rubric of shared physiology.
Right.
It's a tough one to overcome, and doesn't negate the data, but it's kind of again, you're looking at a correlation of biomarkers.
Right, makes sense. And when I look at the Lynn et al. Study, the one, the longitudinal one, I think that was the one. Mm-hmm. They partially exploit the longitudinal nature of the data. They have all these controls in there for personal characteristics and so on. So that's helpful, but the unobservables, where you could use a fixed effect or something like that, even in that study, which is probably the best one in the group, and I don't mean to say that universally, just from an economist perspective, right, given our crazy disciplinary differences. But that one, I just, there's not a full control for unobservables. The effect goes away for lifestyle modification, even in a high risk group. That's the sort of series of things that lead me down this path.
Right. Thank you. Other comments that people wish to offer?
This is Jeff Fisher. Yeah. I'm not sure why I feel like I should comment. I'm not an epidemiologist, but I think, David, you mentioned cholesterol and then measurement of the chemicals in blood and the complexities. I would just say, and maybe it's been done, when you look at blood and the chemicals, one area that's really important are biomarkers of urinary excretion. And so do you have elevated cholesterol at the same time as normal biomarkers, whatever's been measured in urine or blood, I guess? Blood would be perhaps serum, would be preferable. I mean, is that a legitimate question?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, as in all these areas, the majority of studies were reliant on They were cross-sectional and reliant on biomarkers. And again, I don't want to overstate the value of the C8 Health project, but it's one of the few, and there's some other places now too, where you're able to look at exposure based on the drinking water levels. And even though that strikes many people as less informative or direct than measuring what's in the blood, it circumvents this physiology issue and simply compares risk by what was in the water you were drinking. And there's a certain value to that is complementary. And so, again, my own view is that there are shortcomings in all of these research strategies, but when you add in the animal model evidence and you look at it in its totality, again, at least I felt that this is a reasonable endpoint to go after, and they're going after it in a reasonable way. Again, despite all the shortcomings, it's just a matter of being explicit and acknowledging it's this convergence of evidence, I think, that makes the case, not the cross-sectional epidemiology studies alone.
Okay.
Other, Dr. Ma.
Hi. Great. Thanks, Dr. Savitz, for a great summary. I just wanted to echo and that I'm actually really, I didn't write this in my comments, but I'm really supportive of kind of clearly listing out all of the assumptions, because I think some of my comments later on are basically picking up parts of, this assumption was actually embedded in the detailed explanation, but why wasn't it listed in the table of limitations at the very end? And, with the bias signed and so forth. And so I think that would be really nice addition to this document.
And again, I had the same, you could almost call it editorial, because I believe everything is in there.
Right.
It's not, you can't criticize it for being insufficiently detailed, but it's very hard. It was at least hard for this reader, me, to keep track of, okay, what are we doing here? What's the rationale, and what are the implications? And I think there are maybe better ways to it's a presentation issue. I think we agree on that. Good. Other any other comments?
Yeah, if I could say something.
Sure.
You mentioned this, and I'm not finding the details in the report now, but a comment I wrote was, I think in the meta-analysis, the underlying studies estimated a variety of models, some using like the log of the response and others using linear response functions. And my comment was, the answer is orders of magnitude different depending on which of those model forms you assume. So I think it fits in the nature of, you were talking about and this is a reasonable choice, but other choices seem equally reasonable, or
right.
And what effect would that have? And my sense is that this choice actually has a very big effect on the resulting calculations.
No, that's very, that is important, because as I said, I think that many of the choices are unlikely to have a major effect, in grouping the studies and so on. And this one, again, from what you're saying, it has a major effect, and that it's not immediately obvious that one is the right way and one is the wrong way. And those are exactly, that almost defines when you need to do a sensitivity analysis. Good. Any other comments that anyone wants to offer?
Yeah, I have two brief questions. One, on going back to the clinical disease, could some sort of quasi-power calculation be made using the model? Could the magnitude of increase in CVD be detected in the studies that tried to look at the hard outcomes? Because that would give kind of a reality check as to.
I can, and again, this is a sweeping statement and others can comment, but again, it's parallel for all these issues. There are very few studies that it's very easy to do cross-sectional studies. You get a bunch of people, you measure things in their blood, you measure exposure, you measure outcome, and there are dozens, maybe hundreds of studies now. It's quite difficult to do longitudinal studies, let's say, of liver disease or myocardial infarction. You can't do those cross-sectionally. It requires longitudinal data. It requires a large population. The C8 Health Project had that. The Ronneby Sweden studies are sort of accumulating it. There are a handful. And so I would not say that the absence of effect observed thus far on clinical outcomes is sort of exonerates the exposure. But when you think about how challenging studies are of these rarer endpoints and how many other factors contribute as well. Let's say that the cholesterol story is correct. Well, when we're looking at that in context of many other determinants of disease, this sort of chain from PFAS to cholesterol to heart disease, we're introducing a lot more sort of complexity in going from the cholesterol to the heart disease. Other things are factoring in. So it's in part a matter of statistical power, but it's also just the very basic design of a longitudinal study with a large population. And those are still quite rare.
Okay, my second follow-up is on the HDL, and my understanding is that at least for drug targets, HDL has spectacularly failed as in terms of trying to modulate HDL and actually getting to a reduction in CVD. So that makes me question whether even if PFOA or PFAS modulates HDL in the wrong direction or in the right direction, actually, in this case, right? Is there really any confidence that would be any different in terms of the lack of correlation with improvement in CVD risk?
No, Lauren, I don't know if you or others want to comment on that, but your point is well taken, that it's, in order to be important, it's got to follow the whole causal pathway from the change to the consequence. Angela, I don't know if you were going to comment on that.
Yeah, I just don't know if I would agree with that parallel. I think drugs that modulate, who have not been approved, but have been studied to modulate and increase HDL, I believe were problematic because they, in raising HDL, had impacts on other lipoproteins as well. And that's really quite different than when you're using a strategy to lower HDL, like through diet or exercise or something like that. So I just want to say that I wouldn't use those drugs as in that way, or I don't know. It's just a slightly different argument. That's all.
I mean, again, it's that back to that assumption issue, and I would say the same thing about the total cholesterol. It's assuming that the levels are acting the way they do when they're being determined by other factors. In other words, that if PFAS is affecting them, and it isn't. There are counterexamples, as you said, Wei-Sheh, where drugs may not do that. There's still questions about the effect of replacement estrogens, for menopause, whether in fact they have the expected effects on the lipids, but not on heart disease. And so it's not an unreasonable assumption to believe that changes in cholesterol will change risk, but it is an assumption, and it is an assumption that warrants being explicit about, as it would be if they looked at HDL. Okay, I think again, it was a good discussion. I don't know if we're ready to move on. I mean, we're going to touch on a number of these issues in later sections, but I think that I don't have anything else to add to this.
Okay. If not, we're at 12:22. I think we probably can just go on to charge question number 2 before we take a break, if that's okay with everyone. So this is the comment on the life table analysis, right? So the comment on the extent to which this analysis is scientifically supported and clearly described. to the extent improvements are suggested, provide specific changes that are implementable in a US national level benefits analysis with readily available data. And the lead discussant here is Dr. Ba.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Chu. For this charge questions, there were 4 members assigned to review, including myself, and we had each of the assigned members commented on this. Overall, the members generally agreed that the methodology is appropriate and it's generally well described. So one member in particular noted that since this approach takes into consideration kind of the timing of the treatment and the aging of the population, which captures kind of the fact that the impact of the treatment may be partial on some populations. 2 members noted that the descriptions of the approach was clear. However, both had said that table 3 in particular was really difficult to follow. I was one of those members. And there are some specific suggestions about how to maybe expand that table a little bit and to make it a little easier to for the reader. And then let's see. And then 2 members noted that since this life table approach has been used previously, it'd be really helpful to clarify how the current application in this settings differs from previous applications of the life table approach. So for example, one member noted how the EPA used this approach in the 2015 steam electric rule, but maybe there was differences in the CDC prevalence statistics that were applied. And so, some of these differences would be really helpful to point out and to illustrate. Let's see. And then I think this relates to kind of Dr. Olmsted's question earlier on about this general document. So it'd be helpful to describe and hear how some of these impacts might be linked later on with economic studies to monetize some of the benefits. So some sort of description of that would be useful. One member had some specific comments, particularly in the appendix that described kind of the calculations for some clarifications and potential corrections. And so I won't go through the specifics of that, but those should definitely be reviewed and kind of changes made. And then there were kind of several comments that were all kind of isolated, but generally overlap with what Dr. Savitz mentioned earlier about how uncertainty will come in with the various underlying assumptions that were made. And so, for example, a member raised a question about applying the age 80 annual probability of a first hard CVD event to those that are age 81 through 89. If the probability increases with age, how does that affect the estimate? And then let's see. And then there was a question about, how the drinking water source contribution might affect the overall estimate as well. The proportionality, the scaling of it should be clarified. And then the remaining kind of comments relate to, I think, suggestions for additional sensitivity analysis. So again, going back to the comments from the first charge question, things like, so one member had a clarifying question about decision to exclude individuals with pre-existing conditions in the evaluation of treatment impacts. And so what happens if you relax that assumption? How would that change the range of the estimates? So like the output of the life table from the life table approach is this: you have your incidence of CVD, non-fatal and fatal CVD events, but it'd be good to get kind of a range. And then there was also questions about sensitivity analysis relating to, tracking mortality for greater than 5 years after a non-fatal CVD event. So that I think just about summarizes, I think, most of the comments. And so I can go to the individual members that were assigned to this to see if they have any additional comments. So just kind of go in order. So first, Dr. Hammett.
Thanks. In looking through my comments, so I had a lot of detailed comments, or I really tried to sort through the model, which you really have to go to the appendix to do that. And there are a lot of things that I think are typos. There's one equation where I don't understand how it's derived. There's some things that aren't defined precisely enough, but I don't think it's useful to talk about that in the group. So I don't see anything else to raise at the moment. Thanks.
Great. Dr. Kaiser?
Thanks, Dr. Mal. That was a really excellent summary. I think the one thing just to maybe add a little bit more to that you had mentioned was I had made a point in here, and this kind of goes back again, as you mentioned before, to Dr. Olmsted's point about trying to understand how EPA will then measure the economic consequences of these endpoints. And I think it would just be really helpful for them to describe how this approach will differ than from prior approaches in which they monetize the impacts due to cardiovascular disease. And so one of these in here, looking back to one of the studies that they cited in terms of the life table approach, was a study on the Clean Air Act from 2011. And I believe one of the outcomes that was monetized there was hospital admissions. And so in thinking more broadly about the approach that EPA will be taking to try to monetize the benefits here, it would just be helpful, again, for them to describe a bit more in terms of their plans for monetizing these endpoints. And I think more broadly, there just wasn't, I'm curious as well as to, at what point will we be asked at some point to then comment on the economics that will then be added in to this analysis? That would be something that I'm curious just to hear a little bit more from EPA on. But thanks, Dr. Mall. That was an excellent summary.
Thanks. Dr. Savitz?
I think you've captured the essence of it. I really don't have anything else to add on this. I mean, my main point was just making it no more complex than it needs to be, and I defer to those who know the rules of how complex it needs to be. But it takes a certain level of effort and expertise to be able to wade through that and really fully appreciate the not just the nuts and bolts, but the reasoning behind that those obviously have to go together. That's all. I don't have anything to add, though.
So I guess we now open it up to other members who wish to comment on this. Okay, so maybe I turn it back to you, Dr. Chu. Oh, wait, we've got Dr. Kaiser.
Thanks, Dr. Ma. Sorry, I should have mentioned this earlier, but you did mention about a comment of mine and summarized it nicely about thinking about what updates EPA has made to prior, in terms of using, say, these prevalence statistics from CDC to update this life table approach versus what they did in the steam electric rule. But I think more broadly, I would encourage EPA to describe a bit more about how this approach is consistent or deviates from prior approaches that they've used. And again, I think that would just be nice to see so that they can highlight, well, this is where we deviate. These are new assumptions that we're making. This is a new approach we're taking in order to try to determine whether or not those new approaches or those new assumptions are reasonable. Thanks.
Great. All right. Turn it back to you, Dr. Chu.
All right, great. So I think overall there wasn't any critique necessarily of the analysis per se of their approach, but there was a request for more description of the, as Dr. Kaiser just mentioned, how this is consistent or how it's deviated from previous analyses. A lot of detailed comments, particularly say in the appendix, to clarify or correct some of the some of the text, but most sort of prominently in terms of things that beyond editorial and such that they would need to do is more, as was described earlier, more discussion of the underlying assumptions and the uncertainty that come with those, and potential sensitivity analyses to address their impactfulness. And then finally, it's some additional description as to how these will be linked to the monetization in the future. What type of approaches for monetizing the effects are envisioned. So is that anyone have anything to add to that sort of general summary? Yep, Dr. Kaiser.
Thanks, Dr. Chu. As you're talking, one thing that I would like to get a little bit of feedback from others that know this better than me is that when I'm looking at table 5 from the report, these are post-acute mortality rates. And when we look at that table, what we see is that EPA measures this, I believe, for 5 years after a first hard CBD event. And when we look at those numbers, they just stop abruptly at the 4-year mark. But it doesn't look like there's a lot of evidence to suggest that those numbers would actually stop hard at that 4-year mark. It looks like it's just kind of a slow downward decrease in the numbers. And I'm curious to what extent this would significantly undercount the benefits of those mortalities that would occur after that 5-year mark, and if whether or not there's evidence to suggest that, one approach that I suggested is possibly impute that mortality post the 5-year period, but I'm not a specialist in that area, and I'm curious whether or not there would be supporting evidence to suggest that to EPA or not. I'm not sure if this is something that others had seen in that table.
Does anyone have any input as to the post 5-year? Any information that might be useful to EPA? Perhaps this is also a case where, knowing what they've done in the past in terms of this type of analysis and what's been accepted previously would be useful.
Great, thanks.
I think this also probably goes towards this issue of having all of the assumptions laid out and justifying each assumption, and clearly kind of having the support for each assumption. I mean, I think it's probably would be helpful.
All right, any other comments? All right, if not, we have, we're still a little bit ahead of schedule, so we could either take our break a little early, or we could press on. Any particular preferences?
I said take break early.
Okay, all right, so we'll do a 15-minute break. And we'll be back at 10 of the hour. Is that right?
I just wanted to make a couple of announcements.
Sure.
Earlier, we had some technical difficulties in getting the live stream started. And I just wanted to let the folks that are listening in that the only thing they actually missed were my opening remarks, which are similar to those that I presented on the previous 3 days. And anyone who's wishing to make clarifying comments for later on this afternoon, to please send me an email at my email address, shalal.suhair@epa.gov. So just wanted to make sure that folks are aware that they did not miss any of the deliberations that occurred between the panel members. Okay, we'll take our break, 15 minutes.
All right, great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Is everyone back?
Hello.
All right. It's okay if we move on, Sue?
Yes, please do.
All right, great. So now we're on to charge question number 3. And this is related to the application of the atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease risk model that's used to estimate the probability of hard CVD events after corresponding total cholesterol changes. And there's 3 sub-questions about first about the scientific validity of the ASCVD model application for estimating probability of first-time CVD events in the various subpopulations. Second, related to the assumption of a uniform first CVD event hazard distribution over the 10-year period, is that sufficiently robust given current data and literature? If there's additional distributional sources that are suggested, to please provide them to EPA. And then finally, the scientific validity of using the ASCVD risk model for estimating reduced CVD risk stemming from changes in total cholesterol in response to reducing exposure to PFOA and PFAS in drinking water. So here, the lead discussant is Dr. Hammett. Take it away.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll do the 3 sequential, I'll discuss them one at a time and invite everybody else to chime in as we do that. So in the first one about the scientific validity of the model for estimating the probability of first-time CVD events, the people who provide comments generally agree that the model is scientifically valid and appropriate for this purpose. I guess I might mention I checked in with some of my colleagues who work a lot in CVD microsimulation models, and they also supported that. One issue is that it's estimated only for non-Hispanic white and Black populations. Actually, before I say that, the developers of this model, Goff et al., described the model as intended for use by practicing physicians, and that is, quote, based on the types of data that primary care providers could easily collect. So it seems to me EPA is, of course, in a different situation, and EPA may be able to collect other sorts of data or have access to other sorts of data, so they don't have to abide by that limitation. But at least I'm not aware of any other models, including other data, that might provide better estimates for EPA's purposes. But that's something to look into. Then, as I was starting to say, this model is estimated only for non-Hispanic white and Black populations. And so the question is, what should be done to predict risk for Hispanic populations? The authors of the model state that the equations for non-Hispanic whites may be considered for estimation of risk in patients from populations other than African Americans and non-Hispanic whites. That's not really a recommendation. That's just saying we could do this. It's my reading of it anyway. So EPA did something better than that. They actually compared the use of the coefficients for the non-Hispanic whites and for non-Hispanic Blacks for predicting for other populations and had outcome data to compare these with. And they determined that the non-Hispanic Black coefficients were better for the Hispanic populations than the non-Hispanic white and the other non-Hispanic populations. So that seemed like a pretty good justification for the choice of which coefficients to use. But interestingly, this table shows that the model doesn't really seem very good to me, in that even for the populations for which it is estimated, the model error seems to be pretty big, the average prevalence of first CVD events. So there's a table B12, which reports the population weighted average of the absolute deviation, actual minus model prediction divided by the model. It's the fractional error. And for females, the average is 2 for non-Hispanic whites, and 1.4 for non-Hispanic blacks. So to put that in context, the figure of 2 for non-Hispanic whites implies that the actual rate is 3 times the model prediction. So, it's the right order of magnitude, but for predicting rates of CVD events, that doesn't strike me as very good. Report accuracy.
You're killing me, Mom.
Okay. I'm sorry. I will send an email to try to fix that. Okay.
All right.
There was somebody saying that there was an error there.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. So I don't know what that was. So anyway, the absolute error of these predictions might deserve some more comment, and maybe that's just as good as can be done. I don't know this area that well. Dr. Lipworth provided reference to a couple other studies suggesting these kinds of models have poor performance in specific age groups. And also that social deprivation might be an important variable, and that the model does more and less well for groups classified by social deprivation. Also, past smoking status might be a useful variable. I'm not sure if EPA could include that in their efforts or not. So I guess that's what I have on that first part of the charge question. And let me open it up to, I guess, Dr. Lipworth and then Dr. Olmsted.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Hammett. That was a great summary. So I think I do have some concerns generally with the ASCVD model, and I think there's sort of a blurred line between whether these fall under this charge question or whether they need to be addressed in the uncertainties and limitations. But essentially, as you said, the pooled cohort equations, which are actually the basis on which the ASCVD model was created, the pooled cohort equations, most studies that have actually examined the discrimination ability of the pooled cohort equation model have either underestimated or overestimated risk depending on certain characteristics of the study population, like you said. And so there's a lot of in the CVD literature on how the model has performed in older age groups. In particular, the model doesn't allow for any changes in risk associations with age. And so they kind of assign a fixed weight to each risk factor regardless of the age. And there are data suggesting that that does not perform well in people over the age of 65. Same with, race and other socioeconomic subpopulations. And so I think these need to be considered. I don't know for sure that there's a better model, like you said, but I think at least if EPA is going to go forward with this approach, all of those kind of these different subpopulations really need to be considered because they are important and they're pretty well described in literature. So that was all I had to add beyond what you summarized. Thanks.
Sorry, Shaw Olmsted, do you want to add anything?
Sorry, I lost my sound there for just a minute. Nothing major to add. Jim, thanks you for that excellent summary. The only thing I would say is that I had put in a comment about using the non-Hispanic white coefficients for Hispanic populations and Native American populations. And given your comment, I hadn't noticed what EPA did instead. I'll just strike that from when we revise our comments. So I've no longer had that concern. Thank you.
Great. So let me open it to other members of the panel. Yes, I'm not seeing anything. Should I proceed to the second subpart here?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so part 2 was this bit about assumption of a uniform first CVD event hazard distribution over a 10-year period. So the model predicts risk over a 10-year period, and EPA wanted annual risks for their calculations. And I think none of us were totally clear on what the question was about, but Sheila and I both answered, and we answered essentially the same way. So we interpreted it the same. And essentially what EPA did was they asked what constant annual rate leads to the 10-year rate that the model predicts, and use that as the answer for what's the annual risk, which seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to do. One might imagine the risk rises with age, and so this will be imperfect. But my guess is it's a second order issue in modeling and not worth worrying about. So I think we both agreed that this was perfectly fine for the purpose. So let me open it up to first my co-commentators and then everybody else. Anything to add?
I don't have anything to add beyond your summary, thanks.
Others?
Same here, nothing to add beyond what you've already said.
Okay, let me go on to the last part then. So the validity of using the model to estimate reduced CVD risk from changes in total cholesterol in response to reducing exposure to PFAS. So we talked about this a couple of questions ago. The model is based on calibrating CVD events to total cholesterol. And one question is whether that relationship is causal, but for this purpose, what's also important is whether the relationship between PFAS intake and total CVD is causal. And of course, the question of the effects of PFOA and PFAS on HDL cholesterol are not included in this modeling effort, and whether they should be and whether they're causal. Dr. Olmsted noted a workshop report by Mel Anderson and colleagues on the link between PFAS and total cholesterol, and I didn't follow up with that, so I don't know exactly what that's about, but that may be useful. Another general issue that we've touched on earlier that comes into this is how to think about the use of statins and other meds on total cholesterol. So if a change in PFAS led to reduced total cholesterol, it could be that one response to that in the population would be reduced prescription of statins rather than a change in the distribution of cholesterol. So that's something one would think about in the benefits assessment and the health impact assessment. And then there were suggestions about doing more sensitivity analysis related to these factors. And then one other presentational comment, Dr. Ma suggested adding the equation numbers that appear in Appendix B to Table 3 that appears in the main report to help reader understand what the model is really doing and what the details sort of cross-link between the appendix and the main presentation. So let me stop there and open it up. Dr. Lipworth?
Yeah, I mean, this question, I think, gets back to our original charge question of whether taking the risk reduction approach beyond the cholesterol endpoint or the reduced cholesterol endpoint to the CVD endpoint is justified. And so I think, that if EPA decides to move to that step, then all of these levels of uncertainty need to be taken into account, including the jump from cholesterol to CVD. So I think your point about potentially focusing on an endpoint like cholesterol reduction or, decreased numbers of statin prescriptions or whatever that may be, might be a good interim step to consider. But I think, again, this is more of an uncertainty issue for me than an approach issue, in terms of the model, whether the model was developed as it was to show that, a prescription of statins that leads to a decrease in cholesterol could then affect CVD, 10-year CVD risk. Whether that level of risk would be equivalent with a similar decrease in cholesterol related to PFOA is less of a concern than that jump from the cholesterol to CVD for PFOA.
Can I just add, it's a really interesting question. If EPA wanted to do something in that regard, even though, as Dr. Lippert said, it sounds like it's less of a first order concern. There is that work in Lin et al., right? The longitudinal study that shows how lifestyle change mediates, right? The impact of PFOA, PFAS on total cholesterol. So one could maybe take those estimates, again, it's only one estimate, and just push that through, right? To see if there is this, what I would think of as almost a rebound effect, right? Of people's, change in behavior. You could use the kind of inverse of that, that estimate of lifestyle change for that purpose.
Other panel members? Okay, I guess back to you, Weishui.
All right, so I think overall there it was agreed that the model is perhaps the best that there is available for this type of application. Some of the uncertainties, again, perhaps need to be better spelled out in terms of their the sensitivity, or the assumptions, I should say, be spelled out as to their potential impact. Let's see. I think. Yeah, I don't think there's anything else that hasn't been already previously covered in some of the other discussions, other than this potential, secondary effect on medication use. So, anything else? All right. If not, then we'll go on to the last charge question, which I think we've already touched on somewhat. And this is related to section 7 in the appendix A, describing the limitations and uncertainties of the risk reduction analysis. And as EPA clearly described, the individual contributions of the sources of uncertainty. And Dr. Olmsted is the lead discussant here.
Thanks, Dr. Chu. So the review team for this charge question was Dr. Chen, Dr. Kaiser, Dr. Ma, and myself. And so just to kind of give folks an overarching sense for how the uncertainties is being treated so far, Appendix E describes EPA's planned approach to uncertainty analysis, which focuses on uncertainties in each step of the CVD risk reduction model, the kind of PFOA, PFAS serum concentration inputs, to the public water system population size and demographics, impacts of PFOA, PFAS on total cholesterol, the risk of a CVD event given total cholesterol and non-TC predictors, the life tables, the CVD mortality, and non-fatal events. So most of these will be modeled directly using Monte Carlo simulation, and generally the review team thought that EPA was quite clear in that discussion of how that would be done. And then section 7 of the main report describes the many sources of uncertainty that will not be modeled directly, and suggests the likely direction of the effect of each such source of uncertainty on the CVD outcome estimate. So whether it would tend to result in an underestimate, an uncertain effect, or an overestimate. And here again, the review team generally viewed EPA's analysis is pretty clear, the description is pretty clear, but some review team members felt that the agency could be somewhat more thorough and clear in describing the sources of unmodeled uncertainty. We didn't have, specific comments or critiques of the modeled uncertainty piece, and the likely directional effect of these kind of unmodeled uncertainties on estimation and so on. So I'll go through some of those suggestions now. The first is in the organization of table 7, which is this long table in section 7 that addresses the unmodeled sources of uncertainty. It's difficult for the reader to tell from that discussion which sources are likely to be kind of most significant in terms of the likely magnitude of their impact on the estimates. We recognize that, right, because it's uncertainty, we don't necessarily know, right? It's not modeled. We don't necessarily know which ones will be most significant, but it would be helpful to hear in the discussion around that table kind of, EPA's view about which are likely the most important sources. And then ideally those most important sources be sort of listed first with a fair amount of detail in the detail column and, sources cited and so on. And there are, there are quite a few entries in that table that do have a lot of detail, but we can't really tell whether those are the most important ones, right, or just the ones that happen to be discussed in most detail. And then in terms of specific clarifications, some reviewers wondered why systolic blood pressure and other CVD-related outcomes had been excluded. Again, this is part of the broader discussion we've been having about which endpoints and does it come from what can be monetized, or what's most sort of reliable from the epidemiological literature. And in table 7, it notes that these additional endpoints are excluded, but doesn't really talk much about why. In row 10 of table 7, one reviewer wondered why the nonlinearity in the ASCVD model leads to underestimation of CVD impacts when EPA uses the fraction of the population that smokes and has diabetes, compared to when the model uses binary values for an individual patient. And then we suggest adding some detail to row 4 of table 7 to explain what's meant by high quality data. Again, this is something that's come up several times, and the study selection for the meta-analysis is described in detail in Appendix A, but maybe here a very brief list of selection criteria for kind of high quality studies, even as a footnote, would be useful to include. And then finally, is there empirical evidence supporting the assumption of independent effects of PFAS on total cholesterol, which is what's assumed by EPA? And if so, can some sources be cited in row 6 of table 7? And then we had some specific additions that we thought would be helpful. And the first one is related to something that's come up several times before. I think in particular, Dr. Lipworth earlier expressed concern about the exclusion of HDL impacts. I think what's challenging here is that, right, EPA selects total cholesterol and HDL endpoints as the two, kind of outcome variables for the meta-analysis. And then it goes through the meta-analysis, right? It goes and decides to do the TC analysis, but not on the basis of the meta-analysis results, the HDL. But when we come to the discussion of uncertainty in table 7, the kind of excluded other outcomes row suggests that including those other outcomes would, excluding those other outcomes results in an underestimate of impacts, where HDL actually goes the other way. And so it's awkward, right, that we sort of carry HDL through the meta-analysis. There's a positive effect, but not statistically significant. Right, but then it's not discussed in the uncertainty, in the uncertainty discussion as a separate issue, which would have the opposite effect of all the other excluded outcomes like BP and the others. So we thought that either EPA could include an additional row, right, for the, sort of with a little HDL discussion, that those, and indicating that having included that would result in, having excluded that results in an overestimate, a potential overestimate of benefits, or included in, right, the outcomes that are discussed in the existing row with BP and other outcomes that are excluded, but then change the effect on estimate to read uncertain rather than reading underestimate. Another point that we thought was important is that in Appendix E, right, there's a table E1 that notes that EPA is currently evaluating including the PK model in the uncertainty analysis. And the team reviewers were supportive of this because uncertainty around the baseline, kind of pre-policy PFOA, PFAS concentration seems important to model. But then column 3 of this row entry in table E1, where the row says whether the source will be analyzed or not, it currently says no. So we weren't clear, right? It says EPA is considering it, but then in the table it indicates that they've decided not to do that. So we just suggest that this piece of the uncertainty analysis actually be carried out, and then that column 3 entry be switched to yes. And then finally, 4 suggestions for additions to table 7 in section 7 of the main report. 1 would be the likely impact of excluding the population of individuals with pre-existing conditions. 2 would be the likely impact of having assumed that no PWS households will engage in averting behaviors such as purchase of bottled water, right, to reduce their exposure. 3 would be describing the uncertainty introduced by linking the county FIPS codes with PWS location, given the challenge of the sort of spatial match between county borders and PWS service territories. That's discussed in Appendix E, but it would be helpful to mention it in Table 7 as well, because it's unmodeled uncertainty. And then finally, some reviewers felt it would be helpful for EPA to describe cardiovascular impacts that are monetized in other EPA analyses. Again, this has come up earlier, that are not included here. For example, the CVD hospitalizations that are used in the steam electric rule. So excluding these impacts would be, again, a limitation of the current study. And that's it. So I would ask then my review team members, Drs. Chen, Kaiser, and Ma, if they have any additional comments.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Olmsted. This is a very good summary. The only thing I want to add is, so the uncertainty are there and described in, it is not clear about EPA's plan to reduce this uncertainty and how they would actually do, the next steps if, something can be done to reduce this uncertainty. And one thing I think, is try to incorporate the longitudinal studies in the analysis of the potentially association between PFAS and cholesterol levels. And the other thing is to looking potentially cumulative effect of PFAS. And that is an area that, it's a lot of research going on that could study the joint effects of multiple PFAS on the cardiovascular outcomes, including certainly in the cholesterol levels. That's all I have to add. Thanks.
Thank you. That's helpful. Dr. Kaiser or Dr. Ma?
Thank you, Dr. Olmsted. I don't have anything else to add. It's a great summary. Thank you.
Dr. Ma?
Thank you, Dr. Olmsted. I don't have anything else to add. Thanks. Great
Super,
summary.
thanks. Anyone who was not on the review team? Dr. Chu, it looks like it's back to you.
All right, great. So it seems that the Appendix A, the planned uncertainty analysis, the planned quantitative Monte Carlo simulation seemed clear mostly, but the non-modeled uncertainties need some additional, partially maybe reorganization, and some of there's specific comments on specific aspects of that. And then there are some suggestions for additional uncertainties that might, or limitation uncertainties that might be added, and those will be listed in the detailed text. Is that?
Yep, that sounds like a good summary.
Okay, great. So that was the last charge question. I wanted to circle back and just make sure that there weren't any other comments on that people hadn't raised before, either on any of the individual charge questions or on the overall charge in terms of the approach for estimating reductions in CVD risk. All right, seeing as there are none, then maybe you could go back to overall in terms of the 4 documents that we reviewed. Are there any other comments that need discussion that weren't raised earlier in the earlier parts of this week? Yeah, Dr. DeWitt.
So I just shared a document. This is a review paper written by immunotoxicologists, developmental immunotoxicologists, and developmental toxicologists. There's a section of the manuscript that I highlighted that talks about the 5% BMD approach being an acceptable approach for derivation of health protective values, especially considering when the endpoint is the antibody response. So I believe that Sue sent it along to everybody. I just wanted to remind everybody to look at their inboxes.
Okay, great. Any other comments? All right, if not, I wanted to thank everyone for all their contributions and the great lead discussion and a great discussion overall. We've covered a lot of ground in a small amount of time, and then turn it back over then to Sue to manage the any clarifying comments from EPA or members of the public.
I have not received any requests to make clarifying comments, but if there is anyone that wishes to do that, please send me an email. It's shalal.suhair@epa.gov. And, while we maybe discuss a little bit about what our next steps are.
Sounds great. So Sue, do you want to go on to the next steps?
Okay. Not sure if William, do you have the PowerPoint presentation that I sent you? If you could post that up. So while he does that, I will go ahead and give you a little bit of a sort of the next steps about what we want to do. So the first of those steps is to have each of you go back and revise your individual comments. So now it's not as a lead discussant, it is just you individually responding to the charge questions that you have been assigned to, as well as ones that you wish to contribute to. So that's the first step. You would send those revised comments to me. I will then again do what I did earlier and disperse them to the lead discussants that were assigned to that charge question. We ask the lead discussant to then formulate the final response, share it with their team members, and revise everything to create a final draft of that response. Once that's done, that can be sent to me. I will then incorporate all that information into hopefully a coherent report that I will then share with the chair, Dr. Chu. He will have an opportunity to read through and do a final sort of edit of the report. And then once that draft report is ready, we can post it on our website and announce in the Federal Register a meeting. And during that meeting, the entire panel will be able to see the report as a whole, and you'll be able to discuss and refine the report during the public discussion. So that's a general outline of what we want to do. Anybody have any questions?
Sue, the PowerPoint I don't see. Would it be easier for you just to share your screen, or do you want to send it to me real quick?
I did send it to you.
I'm sure you did. I have 5 presentations, but
No, I just sent it to you like 10 minutes ago.
oh, I do not have it. No,
Okay.
not get it yet.
Well, it's not a problem. I mean, it's essentially, it says what I just outlined. So I see Jamie's hand is up. Go ahead and ask your question.
I apologize if you already addressed this. What is the timeline for the anticipated turnaround on our revised responses and the report?
Well, yeah, that was actually the PowerPoint that I was hoping that would be projected, but I will go ahead and share that information with you. Just one second. Okay, so the first step being that you revise your own comments, individual comments. I was proposing January 17th as the due date. That's approximately 10 days from now. And so give you at least 2 weekends and a little bit of time in between. So that comes to me. And then we would have until January 24th, which is another week for the lead discussant to formulate their first draft. And sort of mixed in with that is a due date of January 31st, where I would like to have those final responses done. So you can sort of, there you go, put those two bits together, the January 24th date and the 31st date. You can have your discussion within your groups, within your teams, to create those final draft responses to each of your assigned charge questions. So the 24th is sort of an internal date for the lead discussant to have something available to their teammates. And then the 31st is actually the date that I would like to have those draft responses sent to me so that I can start compiling the draft report. So 17th, 24th, 31st of January are important dates. And then I'm hoping that by the end of February that I will have compiled the 3 reports and provided those to our chair. He will have then approximately 10 days or so to do a quick edit of those reports, sending them back to me. I will need to do a final review and formatting before they are posted on the web. And we hope that if the schedule can be met, that we would have a meeting to discuss the draft report sometime in mid-April to early May. And all of that needs to be announced in the Federal Register at least 30 days in advance of that meeting. So if the report gets posted mid-March, then we can do a mid-April meeting for the discussion. Gloria, you have your hand up.
Thanks. Well, the individual members' final comments and any additional comments like I had edit specific comments, are those posted in the final report? Are they included?
You're talking about editorial?
No, but also I can't remember the process from when I was on other SAB panels because it was quite a while ago. Are each member's final comments included in the report or separately as an appendix, or just whatever forgetting the editorial, just the final comments we submit, are they included in the report, or is it just the summary that the lead discussant puts together includes everyone's comments?
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to create a consensus report. So in as much as they are part of that consensus report, then they would not be separately posted. They would be included in the response.
So even if it's kind of detailed, the lead discussant should include the specific details that each person included in their summary. It's not just a general summary, right? Okay.
Yeah, no, it's a comprehensive response to the charge question. So, including any computations that you are doing, or referencing any publications, any studies, any of that. Yeah, it's a comprehensive response.
And any editorial comments that weren't included could be an appendix or something. Right. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, my understanding is that in the final response, that there won't be attribution of, well, this sentence was this person's comment and this sentence was that person's comment, because it is intended to be a consensus report. And if there are remaining differing views, then it would just say, like, the majority of the panel felt this, and then several members, noted this. So it would be phrased in that manner, not pointing at individual panel members.
So when we're part of this question, I assume but our final comments would be posted online in the same way that our preliminary comments were posted online?
Your revised comments, yes, they will be. Once I compile those, I will again post them as your revised individual comments. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so any other questions? Does the schedule sound okay to folks? Do you think it's too ambitious, or are you?
We have a few hours. We have a few hours today.
There you go.
I guess my question in terms of scheduling the April-May meetings, whether we need to start to do some polling just to get some possible windows, because it can be can be difficult the closer we are to find a time where everyone is available.
Yeah, I can certainly poll folks about their availability during that time period. But I don't want to lock us into any specific time. Mm-hmm. We'll see how things go in terms of getting these responses and getting everything organized.
Hey, Sue, this is Jeff Fisher. Do the leads wait until you send us all the individual comments to compile our version of the story?
Well, I mean, you've already heard some of the discussions and you've taken your notes, and you may have a good idea of what a draft response will be. And you can certainly embellish that with the information that you'll be getting from individuals as we move forward through the schedule. So yeah, go ahead and get started if you feel like you have a good idea of where that response is going.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else?
Any other questions?
Just want to make sure that I didn't get any requests in the meanwhile. I do not have any requests from anyone, so I do not have any requests for clarifying comments. I don't know if anyone from the agency, Morgan, if you had anything to say or if you wanted to clarify anything or get clarification.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. I don't really have any clarifying comments. I just want to thank the panel again for the really informative and important feedback and deliberations.
Okay. Dr. Chu, do you have anything else you'd like to say before we close out?
No, I wanted to just thank everyone again, all the panel members, as well as the SAB staff, and thank Sue for organizing all of this, and the rest of the SAB. And then also thank I know there's a number of contractors as well, and that are working behind the scenes to help make this flow smoothly. And then finally, of course, appreciation to EPA for all their work in putting together these documents. And it was a tremendous amount of information that needed to be synthesized and put together. And although we have many critiques and suggestions, know that we do appreciate all the work that went into it.
Very much so. Okay, well, thank you so much. I appreciate everybody's attention and involvement in this and participation, and I look forward to finalizing this report. And if anybody has any questions throughout the process, please feel free to contact me, and I'll try to respond to your questions as best as I can. And if you need any further information, please let me know and I'll be happy to help you out with that as well. All right, with that, just a final reminder, please CC me whenever you are corresponding with other members of the panel regarding this review so that we can keep records of everything. Thank you so much. And the meeting is adjourned.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a nice weekend.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, sir.
No problem. That was fun. Crazy. No trouble.